For the final panel discussion of the day today, we will talk about cyber resilience, security of the internet infrastructure. In 2021, the average number of cyber attacks and data breaches increased by 15.1% from the previous year. As attacks become more omnipresent, they pose significant challenges to both public and private sector. To discuss this and many more such issues, please allow me to call on stage our panelists for the final discussion of the day. Noel Cowling, Cyber Program Lead, Security Institute for Governance and Leadership, Stellenbosch University. Major General Manjeet Singh, Joint Secretary Cyber, National Security Council Secretariat. David Van Duren, Director, Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, who will be joining this discussion virtually. Ashutosh Chadda, Director and Country Head, Public Policy and Government Affairs, Microsoft India. This discussion will be moderated by Nanjara Sambuli, Fellow, Technology and International Affairs Program, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Panel AV, please.
Good evening. We're here to talk about cyber resilience, but I think I first have to acknowledge the resilience of those in the room. After 12 hours of conferencing, that's a solid building block on the cyber resilience we'll be discussing here tonight. I was looking up some definitions of this term just to get a sense of how we define things, because I'm fascinated by narratives. And overwhelmingly, the definitions on cyber resilience I came across refer to it as a concept rather amorphous that entails systems and their ability to withstand attacks or vulnerabilities. But I think we're going to try and widen the aperture here, because I think resilience is very much about people, as we were talking about, and as the people who are affected by systems. And as the pandemic especially has ushered what not only is a digital century, I think a decade, we heard that we were living in a digital century. We're going to try and see how different perspectives are shaping how all these experts work and what we should be keeping in mind. So I'll go first to Ashutosh, who has, as providers of infrastructure, as private sector, we're typically told leaders of innovation. How are you seeing this shifting, and especially as more and more of us come online? Where are you seeing opportunities, threats, the whole range of things we should be thinking about?
Thanks. Yeah, it's working. So I think, as we've progressed through the years and got more and more digitized, from small-time actors who've used cyber for their advantage, we've moved on to larger actors, and to the extent that now we are seeing nation states using cyber. It's being looked at as now more from an offensive capability for nation states to disrupt, deflect, detract people from what needs to be happening, right? In terms of as well as degrade and destroy in certain situations, infrastructure. And I think so that's very fundamental, because if you really look at the concept of destroying and degrading infrastructure across countries or across territories, right? You are going to hit at the very core of governance, which is trust that the citizens have in society, trust that citizens have in their government, right? And that is social chaos that you're leading into. So when you look at that, and initially what we saw when we saw nation-state actors or we saw large actors using cyber, we saw that more for cyber espionage, etc. But now you're looking at cyber actually being used as a complement or a supplement to war, actual war, right? You have They use various means, whether it is spear or phishing attacks. They look at exploitation of IT services by looking at the weakest link in your supply chain, right? So it's not important that I am protected, or is my supply chain also equally protected, right? And they look at public-facing applications and what are the gaps over there. And we have multiple cases across the globe where you can see that because of the rapid digitization which is happening, the rapid G2G services, G2C services, B2B services, B2C services, there are lots of applications which are not protected. Fundamentally, when you look at cyber, and I'm just trying to build the what we've been seeing as Microsoft, right? You see three specific areas. You look at cyber attacks, which is basically to degrade, destroy infrastructure. You look at cyber espionage effects, right, which is to steal IP, and this is going to become more and more, even for those countries who are not literally at war, but those countries who are using technology. One of the advantages of technology, it's democratized innovation, right? Everywhere, anybody is innovating, building IP, building solutions. The more countries and companies become richer, their IP becomes an opportunity for cyber attackers to use. So this is cyber espionage. And then there's a new part of cyber, which is basically cyber influence, where you start looking at organizations, countries using the cyber as a means of influencing how people think, influencing how people feel about certain issues, right? And these are very, very disruptive areas. Sorry to share a picture which is sort of gloomy, but then I thought it's important for us to know how large is the problem.
And thank you for that, because that tees us nicely to first point that this is not just about systems, it's systems, people, systems, and that cycle. Noel, let me come to you, because you also have a perspective that ties the systems and the people dimension, and how it's playing out with physical infrastructure towards people and the whole gamut that you've witnessed.
Thank you, Nanjira. Yeah, I think when we talk about cybersecurity, we tend to focus a lot on people, or not enough people perhaps, but a lot on software and the interfaces of what happens on software platforms, basically. And we don't talk a lot about physical internet infrastructure, or the geography of the internet, and what that actually means, and the levels of threat that those pose to societies as a whole. And, obviously I look at things always from an African context, and we've been talking a lot today about the global south and about India and about Africa. And as cyber dependency grows and digital dependency grows within societies, the less you can afford a major disruption. The first thing I think is to understand that we're really intensely dealing with systems of systems, where everything is coupled. And if you get into one major system, like a banking system, there are going to be big cascading effects. So that's one thing. So we need to start assessing very carefully as societies or as countries, are we ready to go the whole digital road? What is our level of resilience? And this is a really important question. It's not, great, we're going to get online and we're going to roll out all this stuff. What's the backup? Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is understanding, especially in the global south, we have high concentrations of risk because we don't have the amount of infrastructure diversity. We tend to have a lot of monopolies in utilities and those types of things operating. So then you're also asking yourself, in terms of my internet uptime, what's my energy security like as a state? So coming from South Africa at the moment, we are going through what we call load shedding. It is now a semi-permanent state. So we vary between having power cuts for 2.5 hours a day all the way through to potentially 8 hours a day. And Zimbabwe next door to us is worse. So now, is a digital is digital delivery the best way to go until you get that problem under control? So when we talk about the internet, I think it's very important to also focus on the physical internet. And what we're also increasingly seeing here is theft of bulk infrastructure. Very often going for cables, but you end up taking the fiber cable instead of the electricity cable because you don't know what you're doing. So we've got that problem, and that can, but also targeting of infrastructure like that during conflicts, whether that's an insurgency or a special military operation, you can have that going down as well all the time. And if then the one thing, understanding the role of subsea cables. And this comes down to that big question, for whom does the data flow? Okay, so we tend to think in terms of our walled gardens where we've built, great, we've got, as government, we've got this good cybersecurity, we've put that in place, or as Anglo-American Mining Corporation, whatever it is. When your data leaves your walled garden and it now goes out onto the internet, whether it's a terrestrial or the subsea, where's it going? And I can tell you now that 80% of emails between, for example, Johannesburg and Cape Town don't route directly. They actually go often through Europe or somewhere else before they come back. So we also need to understand this. We need to understand bulk signals tapping, the fragility of subsea cables, how dependent we are on them. So there's a whole big question out there about, are we ready for this? And what do we need to do to get ready for it? Thanks.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think sometimes we run into the risk of resilience being an afterthought or a reactionary measure rather than asking that fundamental question, how ready are we and how do we honestly assess that? And that brings me to you, Manjit, and this notion of identifying critical information infrastructure and the implications of so doing. From a government perspective, how do you see this question of resilience coming in there?
Good evening, everyone. At the very outset, I would like to thank the organizers in this 7th edition of the Global Tech Summit. And the topic chosen, the cyber resilience, the security of internet infrastructure, is absolutely apt. And the dialogue which we are going through is also absolutely apt. I think everyone is a stakeholder in this internet infrastructure, resilience and security. That's the very root of it. And if we can build resilience into it, automatically the trust gets built. More and more people will use the digital infrastructure and will be able to utilize it to the best of our societies for the best benefits of our society as a whole. As a country, we follow a whole of nation approach to address the issue of resilience. And globally, our stance has been an open, accessible, secure, and stable internet. And to that extent, our efforts have been consistent with our philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which means world is one family. However, I would also like to mention at the same time that when you talk of the resilience, for any nation, the national interest and the core interests based on the core values of that particular nation have to be looked into because your digital assets may be widely dispersed, and therefore that becomes one of the critical factors. As we go along, we can discuss more about it. And when we look at the resilience, there are multiple things that make up the resilience, such as the infrastructure and the services being run on that. And as I said earlier, these assets can be globally distributed or within the geographical bounds of a country. And accordingly, the implications and the motivations of resilience may change. So that is something which we need to consider as we go along. Talking about the initiatives of the Government of India per se, I would like to echo these sentiments expressed by the previous speaker from UK, who said it all as far as the Indian cyberspace is concerned, the kind of hugeness of the complete cyberspace is concerned. and the importance of the data, the critical infrastructure, all that was very well covered, and I would like to echo those sentiments. I would also like to echo the sentiments expressed by my co-panelists who talked about threats and challenges. So we have taken on those challenges just to talk about the Digital India program in a very brief, and thereafter the critical infrastructure. On the Digital India, I would not like to quote the statistics too much, but just to give you a quick one, there are 830 million plus internet subscribers, 7.3 billion UPI transactions in 1 month, and it is increasing. And the government's intended target is 1 billion transactions a day. Aadhaar is 1.3 billion. So just to give you some statistics. So we've seen Aadhaar as a most successful project in the world. We have NPCI, UPI, huge transaction I just covered. We have huge e-governance services running. And we have huge dependence on the digital domain for effective governance. And it has got a direct impact on the GDP and economy. So in nutshell, it's a very complex infrastructure and ecosystem exposing itself to a huge attack surface. And this itself is a resilience nightmare. And therefore, we ought to be the biggest proponents of internet resilience. We are for it because we have so much of stakes in that. So that was on the Digital India program. As far as the critical infrastructure is concerned, we have 7 critical sectors. They are going to be more in number in times to come. And we have a nodal agency called NCIIPC, National Critical Infrastructure Protection Center, which is the nodal agency, and it is covered under the legal mandate of the IT Act, through which it's the nodal agency for protection of the critical infrastructure protection. And we have undertaken the exercise of identifying the critical infrastructure under these critical sectors. And through these measures, we are going down to each and every critical infrastructure, to every critical sector, identifying our digital assets, how they should be accessible, how they should become more resilient. We are working on the capacities of these infrastructures, the capability building, the talent, which is to man these assets in the complete country. And all those efforts are directed towards the overall resilience of our complete internet infrastructure. So those are my initial thoughts. As we go along, we'll cover more and more of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David, sitting at the GFC and dealing with different governments and stakeholder groups, I'm curious how you're seeing the definition of resilience or the operationalization of it come into effect. Where are you seeing unanimity? Where are you seeing divergence? If you could share with us some perspectives on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much having me over. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear.
Yes, we can.
I think cyber. Okay, thank you. So if you look for a definition of cyber resilience, I think it's hard to do, and I think and that's also what we as a GFCE are aiming for. But also, if you look at national governments who try to be resilient, it's always there is no silver bullet there. So there's always a lot of measures you have to take technically, also on the human side, that all together, and also capacity building the networks, building the structures, that as a whole makes you more resilient as a country, for example. Having said that, maybe a short introduction on the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. Probably not everybody is familiar with it. The GFC was established, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, in 2015, and that was as a response to a more increased fragmentation in the cyber domain, and that's still going on. And also the emerging need in the domain to bridge the gap between policymakers and the technical domains. And in a response, the GFC was established as a neutral platform, a global multi-stakeholder network, and currently we are comprised of over 175 countries and organizations, and acting as a platform for collaboration and coordination on cyber capacity building, as that was at that time, but certainly nowadays, a challenge. The mission is to strengthen international collaboration on cyber capacities. So cyber capacity building is sort of a key topic within the GFCE, and expertise globally, and encourage the development and adoption of capacity building at domestic, regional, international levels. I think with a focus, the GFCE has a focus on strengthening cyber capacities of countries. For example, those capacities that you will also find in different cybersecurity strategies of countries who are to a certain extent similar. And by strengthening coordination, exchange of best practices and expertise, and matchmaking between countries who have a certain need and countries who are, or parties who can offer support, and we try to matchmake that. The Netherlands and India are currently the GFC co-chairs, as appointed by the GFC community. And one of the, maybe that's also referring, I think, to today's panel on internet infrastructure. Within the GFCE, we have already a long-standing initiative that emerged from the community's area of interest. And that's the GFC Internet Infrastructure Initiative, also called III. And the initiative stemmed from the common understanding that a robust, open, and resilient internet infrastructure is key to counter threats to the cyber domain. Now, why is that? An up-to-date internet infrastructure diminishes the chances and impact of cyber attacks, for example, DDoS, and cybercrime factors, attack factors like hacking, malware, phishing, botnet, spam, etc. A robust internet leads to more confidence and justified trust, supporting increases in the use of internet, and as a consequence, boosts innovation and economic activities. Thus, a state-of-the-art secured internet infrastructure is a precondition for sustainable economic growth and reaping social benefits of the internet. So that's important. So what did we do? Within the GFC, we're very practical. And this initiative facilitates awareness raising workshops in different regions of the world to enhance trust in the use of internet in these regions. In particular, by raising awareness of the importance of adopting technical internet standards as TLS, DMARC, DNSSEC, and the support for the implementation. So that's what this workshop and this initiative is aiming for. And this Internet Standards Deployment Workshop was hosted for the third time in India on the 25th of September 2022 by the India School on Internet Governance, Hyderabad. So this is one thing. For the GFCE, I think one of the key issues for cyber resilience, and that's a very sort of high over one, is to raise political awareness on the importance of cyber resilience. And that also has a lot to do that cybersecurity is has been sort of a domain of its own, not connected to the development agenda or the ICT agenda. And that integration takes place more and more. And we have to raise political awareness to also to get more resources to build cyber capacities for cybersecurity. And so this is a topic that we as a GFCE, with our members and partners, try to make a priority on the political agenda. And to raise political awareness for cyber capacity building, for example, we will provide a workshop on cyber capacity building during the upcoming G20. And also this year, we organized the Global Conference on Cyber Capacity Building, together with the World Bank, with the World Economic Forum, and with the Cyber Peace Institute, which will take place in 2023, and will not only raise political awareness, which is an objective, but also bridge the development domain and the cyber domain. And this is one of the things that I think key developments that has to take place, so we can put more effort in getting building cyber capacities. And one of the goals is also to support the Global South through a demand-driven capacity building agenda and challenge the global community for an in-turn response and support to it. And I think that's important. I think what we focus on in the different regions in the world is to have clarity on what are the needs in different regions. And what you see a lot is that it's not always clear, it's very hard, you have to update it, but also sometimes there's a lack of a demand-driven capacity building agenda in efforts to support certain regions. I think it's important that the agenda comes from the region based on the needs and is in that way demand-driven. So just a few key points on cyber resilience from the perspective of the GFCE, an international network who tries to strengthen international cooperation on cyber resilience, so to say.
Thank you for that, David. You've raised two very interesting things I'd like for us to try and unpack a bit more. Political awareness and capacity building. Ashutosh, let me come to you. What are some of the ways you're seeing capacity in this sense, whether it's the physical infrastructure or the kinds of infrastructure or initiatives and approaches that are helping us move towards that resilience? Because I think sometimes capacity can become an amorphous word, but I think every sector or every actor sees it in practical terms. So I'm curious what Microsoft's practicalities are or recommendations are on that.
So I think there are a few different disparate points, but they're all joined together, right? And I think David talked about, one is the international collaboration is an important perspective. And the other piece which sort of he alluded to somewhere was that I think all of us need to look at security by design. Security is not going to be a slap on. It has to be by design. You have to think about it from the beginning. And it has to be from the most simplest thing to the most complex issue, right? We've all heard this statement very often, which is that the weakest link is actually the human being here. And it is, right? You will always find an individual in an organization, no matter how protected you are or how protected you believe you are, who will click on a silly email or a silly pop-up on the internet. And that could be your gap, right? We've found, for example, when you talk about capacity building, we've found capacity is not just about training, it's about also what you do. How do you protect yourself, right? We found, for example, multi-factor authentication to be a very important thing to do. And every company, every government has been talking about it. But if you do a survey right now, you'll find we still don't follow multi-factor authentication. How many of us do, right? Right. And if you look at it that way, that is one of the weakest links. And those are some simple things that can be put in place. From another vantage point of Microsoft, the way we've seen capacity, especially from when you talk about physical infrastructure, etc., right? This false belief that if I keep my money under my bed, under lock and key, it'll be safe, doesn't work, right? So the assumption that if all your data is in the data center in one location, in one country, it's safe, possibly not. Because remember, it's not just about cyber attacks that you're looking at, you can also look at, in times of war, you can also look at missiles coming down and taking down that infrastructure. You can look at earthquakes, you can look at floods. So you need to have data, you need to have backup data centers, you need to have all of that. Plus we've actually found that moving your data to the cloud does not necessarily mean you lose control of your data. There are lots of technological solutions where you still maintain that data, right? And having your data on the cloud in multiple locations, right, also protects you from physical attacks, especially if your data is spread across multiple geographies and you still have control over it technologically, right? And if you are under attack from a country, that country will not be able to risk attacking a third country because it wants to destroy your data. It doesn't do that. That's another important thing. And finally, leveraging the cloud for threat analysis, etc., becomes extremely important. As a company, as Microsoft, we have the visibility to trillions of signals every day on the internet. And using those signals, not the data in the signal, or in the information which is flowing, just the signals, we can identify something which is happening wrong. So we can figure out that there are certain IP addresses which are being attacked. Now, if you air gap yourself from this ability to see trillions of signals, you will not get to know that you're being attacked. So leveraging data centers, leveraging distributed data centers, leveraging the power of the cloud to secure your data and information, as well as leveraging the power of the cloud to provide you with the tools and technology to protect yourself, is another area of capacity that you need to look at. Countries, organizations need to look at it.
Right. To the theme of our summit, right, brings an interesting perspective here, the geopolitics of technology, to exactly what you're saying, because the securitization, sovereignty question that, Noel, I think I'd love to hear your perspective on. How does that play out? Those are, that sounds like the technical how-to, right, the technical capacity, but I think there's political and geography capacity coming into this question. Noel, let me bring you in for your thoughts on that, because is it possible in practical terms for a country that is, say, on, early in its digital or digitalization agenda to take on that model when they're thinking, okay, I want it all in my country for whatever reason?
I must admit, I think cloud is quite important in enabling potentially states, especially governments or big corporates who have a quite high level of cyber immaturity, to actually leapfrog a few steps. So, for example, a sovereign cloud that's built for a country, I think, can be quite powerful, because if one looks at the power of these technology companies, the wealth of human capital that they're sitting on, it's almost impossible to catch that up if you're late in the game, if I can put it that way. The big question comes in, and this is often what governments will say to you, is how much control do I have, and how much access does the cloud company have to my data? Which is why I also made the point of, okay, that's your walled garden, but now you must think about what's happening outside those walls. There's all levels of access to data. So I think it's quite a complex issue. And possibly, one would potentially look at something like a hybrid type of cloud model. One concern is for certain countries, especially outlying ones like South Africa, is that if the mothership loses control of the cloud or access, like let's say, for example, the subsea cable is compromised, because it's actually a cloud outpost, that cloud will be automatically shut down. So I think these geographies of cloud as well, I do agree one has to have out-of-country cloud as that co-location of data, backup of data, and all the rest of it. So these are complex discussions, but I would not ever say cloud is off the table from a national security point of view. I actually think it can be a national security enhancer. A lot's going to come down to who you're working with and how you're working with them.
Indeed. And we're coming up for questions, so please start teeing them up. Manjit, let me come to you. Having heard these perspectives, what do you think about the usual framing of public-private partnerships in this domain? From where you sit, how do you think they can work towards this cyber resilience?
Public-private partnership is a very important aspect of collaboration. No government can do it alone, and the private sector has to be on board. What model of public-private partnership is adopted is something for study, and it must be taken. The perspective, as far as the private sector is concerned, it looks at from the business point of view, it looks at from the reputational point of view, whereas when the governments look at the complete infrastructure or the partnership, they look at from the national security point of view. What do the private sector have? The private sector have the advanced technologies, tools, they've got the manpower, they've got the skills. At the same time, the governments have the frameworks, they have the intelligence. So in a symbiotic relationship, both are natural partners, and therefore it is incumbent that the public-private partnership is encouraged to the best of whether it is for the cyber resilience or the partnership with respect to the capacity building. Each of that is very important, and the model which is adopted is based on your requirements, your own interests. That is what has to be looked at. As far as India is concerned, we are definitely for the public-private partnership. We have lots of public-private partnership happening through the Cyber Surakshit Bharat, Cyber Shiksha. There are campaigns. There's a ISA program through which the capacities are being built. We are also encouraging the private sector to come up under the Atmanirbhar Abhiyan, so that the footprint of the private sector gets increased and the footprint of the government gets reduced. That's in the overall interest of the resilience to the complete infrastructure, to build that kind of transparency, that kind of trust in the complete infrastructure. So those are some of the thoughts on the PPP.
Thank you. Let me open it up now for questions to our most resilient squad, which is all of you. Please indicate by show of hand or lining up to the mics if you have any questions. You're ready? Fire to go? Great.
I'll be the most optimistic person in the world and ask a question, okay?
Yeah.
So we have been talking about digital public goods, and for me, security is a common goods. Okay? If my neighbor's home is burning, I might be next. So the question I'm asking here is, what is standing between us and really realizing that this is a digital common? What needs to be done? Why a country would not share what they have in terms of security so that everybody can use it? Private companies, GFCA, what are you doing for that to happen? I know that this is a difficult question, but I think that we need to discuss it and make baby step toward that. So I want to see those baby steps. So what needs to be done? Academia.
Great. Thank you for asking a difficult question so optimistically.
Yeah, I enjoyed the discussion a lot. I had two questions, actually. The first one is, with respect to academia, like, for example, in the Andorra Living Lab project at MIT, there's a lot of collaboration between academics and the government with respect to, like, what Ashutosh sir was talking about, like the chilling effect or people monitoring, the government monitoring and trying to influence behavior of individuals. So now that's more of a problem in India, because in India, a lot of our best institutions are funded by the government. So an IISc or an IIT or something like that would tend to would be driven by the government towards research in a particular area. And it might lead to research which would have like an Orwellian nightmare situation. And the second question was with regard to multi-factor authentication. What would you suggest which would be efficient? Because Shamir's secret sharing is not too efficient a technique as far as I know, right?
Thank you for that. Let me invite my panelists to respond by also pivoting to say, what can India set us on to? Because the next 3 years we'll have G20 presidencies by developing countries, so that brings a very unique perspective. As you respond to those, please help us think about how India can kick us off in introducing these aspects into its presidency through G20. David, let me start with you real quick, what your thoughts on that are.
So maybe also referring to some of the questions that were just asked. I think if you talk about digital public goods, that's basically what the GFC is for, and bringing together, best practices from the world that can be also used, for example, to others, like practical guidelines, how to make a strategy, for example, or on how to develop certs or critical infrastructure, what sort of policy is required, that sort of things. Problem is, I think that every country, like mostly activities takes place within countries. They cannot oversee, what is needed around the globe. And what are best practices that can also be used in other regions, for example. So this is what we as a GFC try to pick up, and we establish this ecosystem. We have a civil portal where we have all these best practices, projects on cyber capacity building, tools, having it collected so the global community can get access to it. So that's one step. So we try to create this ecosystem, build this ecosystem to make that work. So exchange best practice, exchange information, to establish support, a coalition. If there's a need for a country, establish a coalition. But it's hard work, and it's we try to develop this step by step. It also has to do with simple things like knowing each other in person, also trust, also interest of one country in another, or one country in a region. We are also, asking and trying to challenge people to invest in a common good, in public goods that are not in particular for one region, but are available for everyone. But it has to do with with strengthening trust between nations, relations, connections, and awareness on what's out there, what is needed. And the good thing about cybersecurity is that everybody has almost the same problem. And so it's this is in particular a topic where international cooperation and exchange of best practice and expertise can be really valuable. So this is one thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing I would like to, if I may, the second thing I would like to reflect on is public-private partnership. And that's also a very hard one, and also different in different regions. I myself was responsible in the Netherlands for the first and the second strategy way back, like 10 years ago. And we identified public-private partnership as a key component. It was in the title of our cybersecurity strategy. But that had to do with a high level of trust between private sector and government within the Netherlands. And we had for centuries this big problem with dikes and floating of water, and public and private and the government and private companies had to work together. So there was already established for centuries, a trusted relationship between the government and the private sector, right, for other reasons. But that was really, that really helped. And so this is for different regions, different countries, you are also looking at probably for different models, and to start from scratch to build up trust and networks, that's hard work, and it takes some time.
Thank you for that, David. Manjit, may I come to you? What is one recommendation you may have for India's G20 presidency, or one of the responses or thoughts you have to the questions we had?
Okay, talk about the G20. I think we need to focus on 4 pillars of cybersecurity. The first one is the protection of the critical infrastructure. The second is the implementation of the cyber norms. The third one is the threat intel sharing and the incident reporting. And the fourth one is the cyber security capacity building to include skill development, awareness, exercises. And these pillars, the cyber security is cross-cutting. So as you are aware, we have a number of tracks in the G20, such as digital economy, disaster risk reduction, finance track, and there are some engagement groups like Women 20, Think 20, and there are a whole lot of them. There are, I think, 8 of them. So under each of these tracks, we can develop these pillars, and depending upon the relevance of that particular track and the pillar, we can probably make a matrix. So it will be a good idea to work on this matrix, and it can go as a recommendation that we work on this matrix and probably prepare an action plan based on this matrix to come out with an action plan which is implementable, which is practical, and which helps the group of 20 countries.
Thank you. Noel, there were questions targeted at academia, among other things, and other reactions you may have.
Okay, so with regard to sharing of cyber knowledge, I would actually say that I find the technical community one of the most sharing, open communities that there is. You know, techies love to share stuff. They're incredible in how giving they are. And you're absolutely right. I mean, in that domain, peer-to-peer learning, I think trumps almost anything that you can do. Somebody spending time, mentorship, that type of thing. Yeah, look, for me, there is so much cyber need. I think there's been a lot of giving in the cyberspace. I'd like to see more work done at population resilience level. I think a lot of cybersecurity initiatives that we see in capacity building are primarily state to state, not even aimed at subnational levels, which is often the coalface, municipalities and whatnot delivering essential services. But certainly the soft underbelly is these large populations. And as we see increasingly infrastructure being rolled out in Africa, we now talk about fiber to the village. It's going out very, very fast. And we have very low levels of population resilience. So our problem's about to get worse. They're not about to get better. So I agree with you with sharing there. We're not closing yet, Shad. You don't want me to talk about India, or do you?
Real quick, you can share, I thought.
Okay. So with regard to you know, India's role going forward, and I think this is also, you know, works in Africa's favor, and looking at the G20. Obviously, one of the things that should be top of mind is how do we re-energize the Sustainable Development Goals, and where does cybersecurity fit then? How do we start refocusing on that agenda, because those goals seem further away than ever before. But I also think that India has a unique role to play globally in global cybersecurity affairs, and that largely comes down to a couple of things. One is the tremendous potential of this country, just in terms of the human capital, because of the STEM skills within India, but more so India's size and youthfulness of India's population. And then, of course, India, I'm going to go into deep water here, has some really very diverse alliances. So we've talked a lot today about the Quad Alliance. We haven't talked about the Commonwealth. India's a senior member of the Commonwealth. And one must stop and think of who are Commonwealth countries here. India is a member of BRICS, which, you know, if you line it up against Quad, you sort of think... and then, of course, India is a member of the non-aligned movement. And importantly, the G20. So this is a powerful mix of different alliances, and the global cyber agenda is grinding to a bit of an uncomfortable halt. So progress that we thought we were making in terms of cyber norms at the OEWG, the UN Open-Ended Working Group, they've stalled, especially this year. And we're seeing that polarity between the great powers is exactly what's stalling it, and as well as the trying to reach agreements in terms of cybercrime treaties, etc. I believe India uniquely can play a role here in trying to get parties to see eye to eye and work together for a common good. And that potentially is the biggest gift we can get in cyber in terms of G20.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Ashutosh, I'm sure you'll want to pile on to that one.
Well, yeah, so let me also try and, take a moment to try and see if I can address some of the questions, right? And to your question, why isn't security becoming a common good, right? If I sort of paraphrase everything that you're saying, I think it's because we haven't looked at... Security has been the realm of a few people, cybersecurity. It hasn't become a common lexicon. we need to take it out from an IT-related issue to something which is on the tips of every person's tongue. The way health and hygiene are today, the way maternal health is, the way poverty elevation is. Security has to become that. Cybersecurity has to become a common lexicon. And I think over there, it's not just the government which has to do some stuff. It's not just the private sector. It's civil society, academia. All of us need to get together. So that's, and to your point, I think things are being done. I mean, every country is trying its effort to do that, but definitely more needs to happen. And that's where possibly that pivot to what can countries do together in Quad or BRICS or the G20 now is coming to fore. And I think we are seeing that narrative getting built up. If you notice in the Quad, the issue of cybersecurity is there. The issue of supply chain resilience and hence security norms are there. So I think we are getting there. We aren't there yet, but hopefully we will get there. To your point in terms of academic and government interface, I think, yes, it's very right to say that a lot of universities are getting funded by the government, not just in India, even globally also they're being funded, and hence the tendency would be to create something which creates an Orwellian atmosphere. I'm a eternal optimist, right? Things have happened, but we're still all here. We still comment, we still go on social media, still talk. I mean, yes, there are concerns that there could be an Orwellian atmosphere soon down the line, but it's soon down the line, right? That's the way I look at it. And I think that soon down the line ain't gonna come, right? To your other point on multi-factor authentication not being the best, yes, it's not the best. There are newer technologies. There are technologies now which can detect if I am Ashutosh using my phone basis the way I'm pressing the keys. So there are further technologies which are coming. But my point when I talked about multi-factor authentication was, let's at least start with that. Let's at least put a lock on the door if you don't have a lock on the door. We're no longer in college where we can leave our college dorms open and roam around, right? And lastly, to what we can do as G20, and I know I have 25 seconds left, is I think, so I completely echo to what General Manjeet Singh said about building capacity, looking at harmonized standards, reporting norms, and sharing threat intelligence. Basically, building confidence, driving capacity, and collaboration. And I'll add just one more piece to that, is I think we need to look at, like we have sustainable development goals, to your point, can we create some cyber development goals and create a roadmap for countries to work towards it?
On that very interesting note, I want you to join me in thanking the panelists for sharing their insights.